Have you ever wondered why her approval feels more real than your own? Not just sweeter, more real. More grounding than any paycheck compliment or even personal achievement. Maybe it was the way she looked at you that one time, eyes soft smile knowing, and for a moment, you felt like a man carved out of purpose. Not because you believed in yourself, but because she did, or seemed to. It probably started years ago. Maybe you were a boy figuring out what strength meant when someone, a song, a story, a culture, told you that to be admired by a woman was the final stamp of manhood. Not just attraction, admiration. Her smile became your mirror, her laughter your proof. You built yourself for that gaze, every success, every sacrifice quietly whispering, "Will she notice me now?" And when she did, you felt alive, seen, real. But when she turned away, you unraveled, and you never understood why. This video isn't about blaming her. It's not about bitterness or anger or revenge. It's about uncovering the quiet cultural hypnosis that convinced you that being chosen is the same as being whole. And the philosopher who saw it coming long before you did not out of hatred, but with unnerving clarity. This isn't just her story. It's yours. And it's time you saw it. It wasn't just a smile. It felt like an arrival. The moment she laughed at your joke, leaned in just slightly when you spoke. Let her hand linger a bit too long on your arm, something inside you shifted. You didn't analyze it, you just felt it. Maybe finally you were enough. Enough to matter. Enough to be seen. And in that fleeting moment of warmth, your soul clung to it like oxygen. Not because you're foolish, not because you're weak, but because no one ever taught you how deep the hunger truly goes. The hunger to be validated not by the world, but by her. And that's the first illusion. You thought it was connection. You thought it was meaning. But what if it was just recognition, and worse, a projection? What if her gaze didn't actually see you but saw a version of you tailored by your own longing, a mask crafted by your need to feel valuable through her reaction? This is where the tragedy begins, not in what she did, but in what you believed it meant. That her attention confirmed your existence, that her approval rewrote your worth. And once you tasted that illusion, every glance, every silence, every smile became a currency, a transaction of the soul you didn't realize you were making. You weren't born needing her approval. That came later, subtly, quietly, like smoke through a cracked window. Maybe it started when you watched your father soften only when your mother smiled. Maybe it was the love songs playing in the background whispering that a man without a woman is a man unfinished. Or maybe it was the movies, the heroes who were brave, strong, and fierce, but only truly complete when she chose him in the end. Somewhere in that slow conditioning, you learned the unspoken rule. Her affection isn't just desired, it's defining. You began to shape your identity around her attention, not as a conscious choice, but as a survival strategy in a world that never taught you how to be enough without it. You were taught that being admired is the closest thing to being loved, that a man's worth isn't fully real until it's reflected in the eyes of someone beautiful. You don't remember who told you that, but it sank in, deep. So you chased it, not with desperation, but with devotion. You performed, you accomplished, you waited, and you told yourself it was love. But it wasn't. It was programming. A centuries-old script written into your mind through culture, scripture, and story. And you never questioned it, because it never looked like slavery, it looked like romance. But underneath it all was a deeper truth. You weren't chasing her love. You were chasing your own validation through her gaze. What if the love you've been chasing was never love at all? What if the ache in your chest, the longing to be chosen, to be seen, to be redeemed by her attention, wasn't romance but illusion? A lie. Not one born from cruelty, but from centuries of well-meaning mythology. And what if one man, a Stoic philosopher named Immanuel Kant, quietly saw through it long before you ever gave her that first longing glance? Kant didn't speak like a modern romantic. He didn't write love poems or offer affirmations. He offered something colder, sharper clarity. While the world was busy wrapping love in sentiment, Kant was dissecting it with reason, not to destroy it, but to understand it. And what he saw disturbed him, not because he hated women, but because he saw how men were enslaved by their own projection of them. To Kant, love wasn't a mystical union. It was often a performance, a ritual of mutual illusions. He believed that men in particular confuse moral duty with emotional dependence, that their desire to be seen as good in her eyes replaces the deeper responsibility of being good on their own terms. He questioned whether what we call affection is truly rooted in principle or simply a mask worn for approval. And when you hear that, part of you may want to look away, but don't. Because buried in Kant's cold logic is a raw truth: she was never the mirror you were. You tell yourself you're in control, that your feelings for her are grounded, natural, even noble, that the reason her approval means so much is because you love her, not because you need her. But if you're honest, brutally honest, you'll feel the difference in your bones. Love is generous, expansive, freeing. Need is something else entirely. It tightens your chest when she pulls away. It rewrites your behavior just to hold her gaze a little longer. And slowly, without even noticing, your self-respect begins to erode. This is the dynamic Kant warned us about, not in dramatic terms, but in quiet, rational observation. He saw that men often submit not through chains, but through need. The desire to be validated by a woman becomes stronger than the desire to be self-defined. Her smile becomes your compass. Her silence becomes your collapse. And every time you mold yourself to fit what you think she wants, you're not evolving, you're erasing. It's subtle. That's what makes it dangerous. Because no one tells you you're giving away your identity. You just feel like you're trying harder, being more attentive, more caring. But underneath it all is a silent bargain: I will become whatever earns her approval. And in doing so, you stop asking who you are outside of her eyes. Kant's point wasn't to shame men, it was to awaken them, to show that a man's moral compass cannot be outsourced, especially not to someone whose attention he craves more than his own truth. Kant didn't write with tenderness. He wrote with dispassion, the kind that cuts deeper than sentiment ever could. And in his cold precision, he described something most men feel but never dare to say aloud: that what draws them to women isn't her mind, it's her mystery, her beauty, her presence, her power to inspire action not through logic but through longing. To Kant, this wasn't accidental, it was design. He argued that nature crafted women not for the rigor of abstract thought, but for the elegance of emotional influence. He believed that philosophy belonged to the masculine, that reason was a structure, and women were never meant to live inside its walls. Not because they were less capable, but because their power came from a different domain altogether. He saw the educated woman as a contradiction, not because she lacked intellect, but because intellect, in his view, robbed her of grace. And before you dismiss him as outdated or misogynistic, pause and ask yourself, why does beauty still captivate more than wisdom? Why do men still crave admiration more than challenge? Why does her silence often speak louder than her intellect? Maybe it's not about women at all. Maybe it's about what men fear, that if she truly thought like them, challenged them, equaled them, she might no longer reflect their worth but question it. And for a man whose identity is tied to her reflection, that isn't just unattractive, it's terrifying. We say we want an equal, a partner, someone who understands us, stands beside us, grows with us. But if you look closely not at what we say but what we choose, you'll see something far more unsettling. We don't want an equal, we want a mirror. a soft reflection of our strengths, our charm, our worth, someone who sees us not as we truly are, but as we hope to be seen. It's not malicious. It's not even conscious. It's survival. When you've spent your life performing for approval, her gaze becomes your validation. And the more she admires you, the more you feel like you matter. But what happens when she challenges you? When she doesn't just reflect, but confronts? When she questions the very mask you wear to feel whole? Most men recoil not out of arrogance, but out of fear. Because a woman who truly thinks for herself doesn't just reflect you, she sees through you. And that clarity can be terrifying. We confuse love with obedience. We label emotional compliance as compatibility. But deep down, what we're really seeking is someone who confirms us, not questions us. Kant understood this imbalance not as injustice, but as nature's strategy. He believed women guide men not through reason, but through charm. Through influence, not confrontation. But maybe that's the real tragedy. We're not building relationships. We're building hallways of affirmation, hoping our reflection in her eyes will be enough to feel real. You called it love. You told yourself it was connection, that the way she smiled, touched your arm, or leaned in during a quiet moment was proof of something real. But what if it wasn't love? What if it was persuasion, subtle, unspoken, and unintentional? What if her presence didn't invite you to be yourself, but slowly trained you to become whatever kept her gaze locked on you? You changed. You laughed a little softer. You softened your voice. You suppressed your anger. You apologized more than you needed to. Not because you were weak, but because you wanted to protect what you thought you had, her warmth, her attention, her affection. But underneath that dance was a deeper trade. You gave her performance, and in return, she gave you approval. Kant would have called this not romance, but performance ethics men, operating not from truth, but from calculated behavior that earns admiration. And slowly, almost invisibly, you stopped asking yourself if she loved you and started measuring how well you were being received. You shaped yourself around her response. Her praise became your pulse. That's not love. That's dependency masquerading as intimacy. It feels deep because it costs so much. But if the connection only survives when you hide your edges and bite your tongue, then what you're building isn't love, it's a mask. And the longer you wear it, the less you remember who you were before she looked at you that way. Power isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear a crown or carry a command. Sometimes power is soft. It's a glance, a smile, a slight withdrawal, a moment of silence that suddenly makes you question everything about yourself. That's the kind of power you never see coming because it doesn't look like force. It looks like meaning. When she smiles at you, it lights you up. Not because you're shallow, but because you've been taught that her attention is evidence that you matter, that you're doing something right. And so, over time, her approval becomes your compass. You adjust. You shape yourself to keep that light shining. You stop acting from truth and start acting from strategy, not to manipulate her, but to protect the fragile image of yourself that only seems to exist when she's admiring it. Kant understood this unspoken economy. He didn't say women dominate through strength. He said they influence through need. Once a man believes her validation defines his worth, she doesn't have to pull the leash, he holds it himself. And what's terrifying is that she may not even know. She may simply be responding to your performance, unaware that you're building your identity around her gaze. This isn't about blame. It's about awakening. Because if your worth rises and falls with her attention, then your life isn't being led, it's being directed by someone who never asked to hold the reins. And you, without knowing it, are no longer acting from principle. You're reacting from hunger. Kant believed that men are governed by duty, by principles, by moral universals that transcend the moment. that a man at his highest chooses to act rightly not because it pleases him, but because it's right. He saw moral action not as a feeling, but as a command, an inner law rooted in reason. But he didn't see women the same way, not because he thought they were lesser, but because he believed they were ruled by something else entirely: taste, emotion, immediacy. To Kant, a woman's morality wasn't forged through logic or abstract thought. It emerged from presence, from the emotional rhythms of life. She didn't arrive at virtue through reasoning, she became virtue through her influence. And that's what unsettles so many men. She doesn't argue you into becoming better. She compels it, often without a word. This is why her validation feels so powerful and so dangerous, because it doesn't feel earned in the rational sense. It's given or withheld in the moment, based on tone, mood, timing. And when you receive it, it doesn't affirm what you did, it affirms who you are, at least for that moment. And when it's gone, it's like gravity disappears. The tragedy is that most men don't even realize they're being governed by it. They believe they're leading, deciding, acting, but in truth, they've outsourced their ethical compass not to principle, but to the ever-shifting winds of emotional approval. And that's not leadership. That's submission in disguise. It begins innocently. You make her laugh, she lights up, and something inside you shifts. You want to make her smile again. Not just because it feels good, but because for a moment it feels like proof that you're enough, that you're valuable, that you're seen. And so without realizing it, you begin to chase that feeling not just occasionally, but constantly. Her gaze becomes your fuel. Her approval becomes your compass. And before long, you're no longer acting from who you are, you're acting from what earns her attention. This is the addiction Kant never framed as addiction, but it lives in every man who reshapes himself to stay admired. Every choice becomes a calculation, every silence a test. You don't ask yourself, is this true to me? You ask, will this keep her interested? And with each adjustment, each softened truth, each swallowed frustration, a piece of your authentic self quietly disappears. Not because she asked for it, but because the reflection she offers is intoxicating. She sees a version of you you've always wanted to believe in. And like any addict, you chase that feeling again and again, regardless of the cost. You abandon the parts of you that don't fit the image she was taught to admire. And in doing so, you don't just lose her, you lose yourself. Because a man who lives for her gaze can never stand alone in his own. He only exists when she's looking. Kant never believed in equality as sameness. He believed in harmony, a balance between opposing roles, not a fusion of shared identity. In his view, man was built to reason, to act from principle, to lead through clarity. Woman, by contrast, was nature's emotional counterpoint, not his rival in logic, but his mirror in feeling. She was the reliever, not the builder, the inspirer, not the architect. Her strength wasn't in confrontation, but in the power to influence without ever needing to argue. And while that idea may sound antiquated, look around, it still lives in the modern man. We're told to chase greatness, build empires, start companies, craft legacies. But beneath that ambition is often a quieter need, the need for her nod, her smile, her approval. You can win at life, but if she isn't impressed, you don't feel victorious. That's the invisible script still playing, the one that says, you may lead the world, but you still need her to crown you. This is the quiet war inside the modern man. The tension between his pursuit of purpose and his hunger to be chosen. The desire to stand alone and the longing to be seen. Kant understood this conflict not as failure, but as design. But maybe that's the trap, because the more you believe you were meant to be opposite, the less you question whether you've ever stood whole on your own. You told yourself it was love. You believed your efforts, your attentiveness, your vulnerability, your sacrifice were noble. You gave and gave and gave. Not for control, not for reward, but because you thought that's what love looks like. But if you peel back the layers, if you sit in the quiet after she pulls away, you might see it for what it truly was, not love, but dependency dressed as devotion. Because when her smile determined your mood, when her silence unraveled your sense of worth, when her validation dictated your sense of masculinity, you weren't loving her. You were surviving through her. You handed over the weight of your identity, not because she demanded it, but because somewhere along the way, you believed she was the only one who could hold it. And once that belief took root, every glance from her became affirmation, and every absence felt like erasure. Kant foresaw this psychological transaction. He warned that when a man builds his sense of self on emotional resonance instead of rational foundation, he becomes vulnerable to external forces he cannot control. He mistakes emotional approval for moral clarity, and in doing so, he does not rise, he submits. This is not love, it's leverage. A quiet surrender masked by sentiment. A longing so deep, so invisible, that it hides beneath the language of romance. And until you name it, it rules you not like a tyrant, but like a god you never meant to worship. What if neither of you are real anymore? Not the man you've become, nor the woman you've chosen. What if without realizing it, you're both acting not out of deceit, but out of inheritance? You were taught to become the version of yourself that earns her gaze. She was taught to become the version of herself that holds it. And in that silent exchange, something essential was lost: authenticity. You don't know when it started. Maybe it was the first time she smiled and you adjusted your voice, or when you held back your truth to keep her interested. She responded not always out of strategy, but out of rhythm, sensing what pleased you and offering just enough to keep you reaching. It wasn't manipulation, it was a dance. One choreographed long before either of you ever met. Kant called it architecture, not just of roles, but of perception. Man, the builder. Woman, the mirror. And so you projected, she reflected. And over time, you confused performance with connection. You thought she understood you, but really, she was reflecting the man you were trying to be. She thought you led, but really, you were chasing her affirmation in every gesture. This is how identity erodes, not in an instant, but in 1,000 micro-adjustments. You don't notice until you're hollow, until she walks away or worse, stays, and her gaze no longer lifts you. Because it was never you she admired. It was the role, the mask, the myth. At some point in every man's life, he must confront the uncomfortable truth that many of his relationships were not built on love, but on need. Not mutual understanding, but silent performance. And the most painful realization of all, that he was never truly seen, only reflected. The lesson here is not to blame her. It's to stop outsourcing your identity to her gaze. Because as long as your sense of worth is tied to how a woman responds to you, whether she smiles, compliments, chooses, or approves, then your power doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the mirror. You don't become a man by being admired. You become a man by standing in front of your own reflection and seeing yourself clearly with all your strength, flaws, rage, tenderness, and ambition, and saying, "This is who I am." Even if no one is watching, start there. Don't shrink yourself to keep her. Don't perform masculinity like a role. Stop adjusting your truth just to stay desirable. Instead, build a life rooted in principle, in values that remain even when no one is validating them. And if love comes, let it be with someone who sees you not for how well you mirror their fantasies, but for how fully you've stepped into your own being. Because real connection begins when the mask falls. And a man who doesn't need to be seen to exist is finally free.